I'm Kerry Fink, and welcome to this edition of Transforming Your City Television. It's all about transforming your city through marketplace leaders and marketplace ministry. And today I have the privilege of sitting with Dr. Dave Robinson and also Dr. Paul Rosbury. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show.
Thank you.
So, what we're in town for, we're in Melbourne, Florida, and we're getting ready for the very exciting Transforming Your City Masterclass. And it's it builds upon something that's been going on here already for a couple of years. It started maybe a couple of years ago when you came to town, and we actually had a Transforming Your City conference where we talked about possessing the gates of your enemy, and also as a real discussion to get people here to start to understand the importance of marketplace ministry. So now, as we're here today, we're coming back. A lot of the same people who have been participating in Transforming Your City are back for the masterclass. We're really excited because we're going to have a master discussion panel with about a dozen different leaders in the three key areas of influence in our community, which of course is business, it's government, and it's education. So we were sitting here today talking a little bit about the book, Dr. Dave, that you wrote called Possessing the Gates of Influence, or Possessing the Gates of Your Enemy. And this book really is an introduction to the whole concept of the importance for us as Christians to take our rightful place in the marketplace. So I want to welcome you to the show, but I wanted to ask you the first question is to just give somebody who may not be familiar, they may have heard the term marketplace ministry, they understand it generally, that it's something about, as a Christian, I have a responsibility to do something in the marketplace, but it's never really been defined for them past that. How do you introduce that?
Well, Kerry, the way I introduce it is there are three gates of influence. And I was praying and studying one day about how do you disciple a whole nation? You know, the church I grew up in, they struggle making disciples one at a time. And the Lord led me to Genesis 22:17 and 24:60. Most people are familiar with Genesis 22:17. When God was giving the blessing to Abraham, he showed him the stars of the sky and the sand of the sea and said, your children are going to be like those. But the very last phrase of that verse says, and you will possess the gate of your enemy. And I read that, and then he said, read 24 verse 60. And Rebecca's getting ready to go back to be the wife of Isaac. And the last thing her family said to her was, may your children be thousands of tens of thousands, and may they possess the gates of those who hate them. Then the Lord said, read Matthew 16 verse 18, a scripture that we're much more familiar with. Jesus is speaking, and he said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, the people he was speaking to that day, they knew exactly what he meant. But I think a lot of people today, we don't understand what those gates are. And so I spent a lot of time studying the Old Testament gates. There are 345 references to gates in the Old Testament city. It's where everything happens. It's where kings, they would stand in the gate and declare war against their enemy. It says of David, when he was going through a rough time, that he went up to the tower over the gates and wept over his city. Samson carried away the gates of Gaza. Why? So that he could let the city know they're now vulnerable for the enemy's attack. And so the Lord shared with me there are three gates of influence that control every city, every county, every state, and actually every nation. And those three gates are the business community that pays for everything, the government community that controls everything through laws and regulations, and then there's the educational community that determines the values and philosophies that both the government people and the business people use every day. And he said the church, if they want to transform a city, if they want to regain the moral high ground in their city or their county, then they must flood those three places of influence with Christians who know they're there, not to simply have a job to create income to support their family, but they are there as Christ's ambassadors to gain places of influence so that the righteous now control the city and the unrighteous no longer.
You know, there's going to be a lot of discussion about exactly what those two models of how a city would be look like. But I want to take a minute and also introduce Dr. Paul Rosbury and say you really are an embodiment of marketplace ministry in this community. I love to tell this story. I was with Dr. Paul, and we were at a local fast food restaurant, and somebody comes walking up to a table and speaks to a gentleman sitting at the table and says, "Excuse me, sir, which church do you go to?" And the guy kind of fumbled because he didn't really have an answer for that. And what Dr. Rosbury said next was absolutely priceless. He said, okay. He said, "I pastor the largest church in Brevard County," and I don't want to give away the punchline. Let me let you take it from there.
And I basically, from there, I just said, "I'm your pastor," handed him a card, said, "Anytime you need me, here's my phone number."
Yeah, because the whole point was, he said, "Well, what do you mean the largest church in Brevard?" He said, "Yeah."
Yeah. Basically what it amounts to is in Brevard County, there are 353,000 people that aren't claimed by any church. So I've just claimed them all for Jesus.
And the guy started laughing, and he said, "Okay, I'll do that." You know,
Exactly.
Nobody had ever invited him to church before, and in this case, you just invited him to have a pastor, so there's somebody he could talk to and start walking on a spiritual journey. Now, through what you do with the Tapestry vision and all that you do, you're very marketplace focused. Talk a little bit about some of the ministries and things that happen there.
Well, with Tapestry, there are three primary areas of influence that we're looking at, and that is business, education, and government.
Right.
And we kind of touch on the social ministry, which is quasi-government church, and then the families. But primarily, it's business, education, and government. And so the ministry that I do is more of a ministry of empowerment. In other words, if they need help with their ministry to get started, that's what I do, whether it's in the business area or actual doing social ministries or anything of that nature. So when we look at it, we say, okay, how many ministries do I have influence over? And over the years, it's been, I think right now, well, we're into 2,300 prisons right now. We have churches or small churches in the Philippines and West Africa. And then here we have a flight school that teaches teenagers that doesn't cost the teenager to get a pilot's license. And then we're actually training them to go into mission fields in the Bahamas and Central America or the Caribbean area. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. And every time somebody comes and says, you know, I'm called to do something in the ministry, it doesn't matter what it is. I've got another person right now who we're developing into ministry that wants to do exit strategies for people coming out of prison and get them into jobs and careers. And so, you know, it's just whatever the Lord brings our way, we try and help them and empower them to be what God's called them to be.
No, it's good. When we talk a little bit about possessing the gates of your enemy, and we talk about these three gates of influence, oftentimes people draw an analogy and say, well, isn't that like a seven hills something? Or they have other ways to think about it. And you brought up a very powerful point, I think, that we can divide the landscape any way we want, but if we really think of it as a battlefield to take back what the enemy has stolen from the Christian camp, we really need to strategically consider these three areas. And I wanted to ask you to maybe explain a little bit more about that.
The seven mountains of influence, which has been around for a long, long time, that vision was given to Lauren Cunningham, who started the largest missions work to this date called YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And he shared it with Bill Bright, a good friend of his, and Bill took that message worldwide through Campus Crusade. But they both admitted some years later that they shared it with the wrong people if they wanted it to really get traction. They shared it with those whose world is the church world, and they agreed that we need to have influence in these 7 mountains, but they really aren't the ones that go out to those mountains. And they wish they had shared it with marketplace people who actually go. And so when the Lord began to give me what he did, and I said, Lord, now it sounds a lot like what you gave Lauren Cunningham. He said, no, that was what I gave Lauren. He said, what I'm telling you is these are not mountains to be climbed, but these are entities to be invaded or infiltrated. And you have to bring real value there. It's not our message, it's not the gospel that creates open doors for us. It's the bringing of real value to the area of that marketplace, whether it's business, government, or education. And so you have to bring real value there, and then God's favor will elevate you through the process till you get to the place where you are now making the decisions. And and so if we want, again, to transform a city, we have to be in places of influence to be able to do that. And so the commission is to go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples of all nations. You can have a nation be 98% Christian, but if the 2% are unbelievers and they hold the authority in business, government, and education, they still control the city. And so it's a challenge, for the church to make this mental shift to where it's more than just having church, it's being the church and being empowered to know who you are when you go to that marketplace. Because there's only 3 areas that anyone in any church, anywhere in the world, they're either going to own a business or serve in a business, or they're going to serve in government at some level, or they're going to be in the education. If you have influence, major influence in those 3 areas, the other 4 mountains will come right along.
And that actually brings up a point when we talk about having influence in these areas, and I'd like to spark a discussion with both of you about this. But one of the challenges is, I think in the concept of marketplace ministry, there's a real need to get outside of the 4 walls of the church. I think you've described it as having locker room meetings, but we don't get out on the field and play the way we should in terms of taking back this territory. How do you describe that to Christians who are interested, but then oftentimes we gather at church and we complain about decisions that are being made that affect our lives by government entities or things that they may be teaching our children in schools that we may or may not agree with. And so I think the argument is, how do we foster this place of we've got to get out of the locker room and onto the field?
Paul?
Well, there's a couple of ways that I'm perceiving. First off, where 2 or more are gathered, he is in the presence.
Yes.
Okay, and so everybody needs a coach. Everybody needs someone that they can work with. And so that's basically the same thing that I'm doing with whoever I run into, is that I'm making myself available to coach them. And if they have any questions, I'm not saying, here, come and listen to me teach or preach or so on like that. I'm asking them to say, hey, you need somebody, here I am. And then I can guide them, because if they're seeking something, I can help direct that. So it doesn't matter where they're working, whether they're working in a business or a restaurant. I was in a restaurant the other day, and the waitress, I'd known her for a while. I said, by the way, I said, are you a part of any church? And she said, no. And I said, well, here's my card. I'm your pastor. So now when I walk into the restaurant, she says, my pastor's here. And so it's influencing that place where we're at. And that's really what it's all about. And if we get more and more people who are influencing, and saying, you're part of what we're doing, and then when they have those questions, when they have those needs, I get a lot of emails and stuff like that of people who have needs, and I respond to them as we can, So, but I always answer the phone or call somebody back or always reply to that email when there's something going on. And that's kind of like the inclusion. So you've said to me a number of times that I know a lot of people in Brevard County. And I say, no, I really don't know a lot of people, but a lot of people know me. And when somebody comes up with a need or something like that, they say, well, call Pastor Paul, call
Sure.
Paul. And that's what happens. And so that's a place of influence, but it's not a place of control. And so the other side of it is the church. When you talk about the four-wall church, I see the four-wall church being more and more irrelevant into people's lives. In other words, they come and preach, or they come to Sunday school, or they study, but they never really do anything with what they're learning. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at calling them to whatever God calls them to be. And whatever that is, and I also teach them that if you're called to be a nurse, that is your ministry. It's God is calling and gifted people. And I think something Dave said the other day, struck a chord with me, is that the gifting that people get is from the time they're born. And
Yes.
how they use that gift, either for the kingdom or not for the kingdom, is what we're called to guide them into, to disciple them into. Is that if they're called to do this, then every job that they have to do it to the best of their ability as unto the Lord. And that's what the Bible teaches. So it doesn't matter whether you're a ditch digger or a plumber or whatever. The point is that we've got to teach them that this is their calling, this is their ministry. So,
And it seems like there's a challenge these days, because a lot of times, particularly in the polarized world that we live in, where it's so easy to get offended or cause an offense by just something that you say, whether it be political or religious or any kind of thing. There's just everybody is on, that expression, DEFCON 1. They're just waiting for somebody to say something that lights them off. And so it seems like in that environment that traditionally in the church world, we all run to the church and we huddle inside this building and we say, can you believe this craziness that's going on out there? And then at the same time, we seem reticent to go out there with the four-letter words and all the things that exist out in the marketplace. How do we get past all of that?
Well, the question you asked Paul reminds me, I played a lot of high school football and basketball. And during those 2 seasons, 7th period was canceled on game day, and we all went to the auditorium for a big pep rally. I mean, everybody's there, cheerleaders, majorettes, the band, all the coaches, everybody. And, it reminded me a lot of church, because I grew up in that very energized church world. And I often thought, well, what if at the end of the pep rally, the coach stepped out, thanked everybody for coming, and said, we'll see you here next week, same time. And somebody raises their hand and says, well, what about, are we playing the game tonight? Oh, no, we don't need to play the game tonight. We had such a wonderful pep rally. We don't need to play the game tonight. That's what we're missing, is we don't need to stop anything we're doing in the church building, the locker room, I call it. We just need to go play the game. And we need to teach people how to be comfortable around sinners. Jesus was very comfortable around sinners. In fact, sinners were very comfortable around him. They invited him to all the parties and all the weddings and all the activities, because the Bible says he was a friend of sinners. It doesn't say he was a friend to sinners. It says he was a friend of sinners. That doesn't mean we go along with their jokes, their lifestyle, or any of that, but we don't have to go out condemning, because if you want to narrow your influence real quick, go out condemning people, their lifestyle, whatever it is, but go out knowing that greater is he that's in us. I mean, the power that we're going to face out there is nothing compared to the power that rests within us. But that's not being taught. The church has been locked up in these buildings since Constantine. There were no buildings until Constantine began to build them all over the Roman Empire. Until then, it was house churches. Now, I'm not advocating we go back to that necessarily, but when we have these wonderful locker room meetings, then let's find a way to get outside that locker room and go play the game.
Yeah, we were having this conversation. I know you have a ministry friend who has quite a large church in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, and I think he has a sign or something as you go out of the sanctuary on your way out. So now you're now entering the mission field or something to that
Yes.
effect. And it really speaks to the fact that if we don't step out, I often use the expression sometimes that person on the job is the only Jesus somebody is ever going to see when they're in a crisis situation, and that's why that ministry of presence is so important, and equipping Christians to be able to get outside the church and make that difference when they run up on the scene of an accident, so to speak. I'm not talking about a physical accident, but I'm talking about a spiritual accident or something like that.
There are no accidents.
Well, that's right. That's a
Well,
good
I
point.
remember, I think I told you the story of the guy that played in Indiana Jones. I forget the actor's name.
Harrison Ford.
Harrison Ford, when he crashed his vintage plane on a golf course a number of years
remember
ago.
that.
And there was a foursome playing not too far from where he crashed, and they ran over to the plane. And you remember what their profession was?
Yes.
They were all doctors,
Yes.
and they knew exactly what to do. It basically saved his life. To me, the body of Christ should be that alert to what's going on around them, that when they come up onto a life that has crashed and burned, a situation that is in deep trouble, they know exactly what to do because they've been trained to do it.
And one of the things when we have this Transforming Your City masterclass, and this time we're doing something a little bit different than in the past. In the past, we've had panels where we had a group of educators together to talk about the issues in education. Then we had a group of government leaders to talk about the different things that they were facing, we've had congressmen speak, we've had county commissioners on the panel, city council people on the panel, so all different aspects of government. And then we had a panel of business people who are all strong Christians, but who are successes in the business marketplace. Tomorrow we're going to try to bring everybody together and foster a discussion amongst them. I'm curious to get your thoughts and ideas, because this is really the conversation that needs to happen. Christians need to work together to actually take over all of these areas and kind of in a strategic way.
Well, there's been a lot of effort in the business community, especially since Demas Shakarian in the mid-50s started Full Gospel Businessmen. And then you have people like today, Ralph Dollinger, who his ministry called Capital Ministries has a Bible study in every state capital in America. What we need to see is the coming together in a coordinated effort between all three, the weakest being the educational community. But if you really want to transform your city or your county, get all three groups, not stop what they're doing, but start talking about how to coordinate this together for the purpose of gaining superior influence.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I was thinking as you were saying that, when we put together the panel that's going to be discussing tomorrow, it was interesting because it was very interesting that a lot of the people could be on either panel. So sometimes we had business people, very successful business people, who saw a calling to go to serve in a government capacity. And then we've seen people who are in education, but who are very successful entrepreneurs. I mean,
Yes.
it's interesting that it seems like Christians somehow innately understand that their role is to influence on more than one level, that's not just limited to that. And I think as we bring that kind of maybe a way to think about it, it gets people even more on point with what God has for their destiny to be influential in the marketplace. We got about like a minute left, but I just wanted to, how do you see that as you talk to people and they come to you in different places, different experiences, different skills? How do you assist them in finding the thing that God has called them for?
Well, most of the time what they're looking for is they're looking for someone that can give them direction, okay? And a lot of times it's just something very simple that just needs to be done, or they just need to learn something. However, my experience has been is that by reaching out and helping and making myself available, and basically I don't charge any fees for all of this, it's just things that I do. But later it comes back, and there is a great influence, and it builds that community. So I'm looking at it now, and I'm saying, okay, maybe I do know a lot of people. Matter of fact, I went through my address book, and in Brevard County, people that I know personally that I can sit and talk with like you and know a little bit about you. I have over 480 people in my address book that I know personally. Sure. And that know me personally. Sure. And so if you take that and you say, how does that work? Is that if somebody needs something I'm not able to do, I'm able to give them to somebody else. So it's the community working together is really what it amounts to. And I think that's really the marketplace ministry is the vision that the Lord gave me with the Tapestry. Businesses would work together and not be so competitive that they would help one another, and so that they could build in the community. And that's what the Lord showed me, is that what we have to do there. Same thing with the educational, same thing with government, is that government needs to be in the community, but not just part of the community.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paul. I really want to thank both of you gentlemen for being with us today on this. And this is, as you can tell, there is so much that we can talk about. This is a to be continued conversation, and let's just be excited about all the good things that are going to be happening as we step forward in transforming your city through marketplace leaders. Thanks, guys.